He thought he was removing a nobody from the room, but in less than 5 minutes, the room would remove him from everything he thought he controlled. The sound of a chair scraping sharply across the polished wooden floor cut through the quiet like a blade as Officer Daniel Brooks stepped forward, his hand firm and unapologetic as it closed around the arm of a seated woman, his voice low but carrying enough weight to command attention. "You need to leave now," he said, not asking, not explaining, just deciding. The kind of decision that came from years of believing authority was something you wore, not something you earned. And for a brief moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The long conference table lined with neatly arranged folders and half-filled glasses of water became a silent witness to something that felt wrong, deeply wrong, yet strangely familiar. The woman he had singled out did not resist. She did not pull away. She simply looked at him, her expression calm, almost unreadable, as if she had seen this moment coming long before he ever walked into the room. Her name was Angela Carter, and while her clothing was simple, a dark blazer and a soft blue blouse, there was something in the way she carried herself that did not match the assumption already forming in Daniel's mind. But assumptions were faster than truth and far louder. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. The room itself was one of those spaces designed to hold power, a federal advisory meeting in downtown Washington District of Columbia, where decisions shaped policies and policies shaped lives. The air carried the faint hum of the ventilation system, blending with the quiet tension that had now settled over every person seated around that long table. Men and women in tailored suits exchanged quick glances, some uncomfortable, others deliberately avoiding eye contact because stepping in would mean stepping out of line. And line was something people in rooms like this rarely crossed. Officer Daniel Brooks straightened his posture, his uniform crisp, his badge catching the overhead light, as if to remind everyone present exactly who he believed he was in that moment. "This meeting is restricted," he added, his tone sharper now, as though repeating it would make it more true, as though saying it loud enough would erase any doubt. Angela slowly rose to her feet, not rushed, not intimidated, her movements measured, controlled, the kind of control that did not come from fear, but from understanding. She glanced briefly around the room, her eyes passing over each face, not searching for help, but observing, taking in the silence, the hesitation, the quiet complicity that often spoke louder than words. And then she looked back at Daniel, her voice soft, steady, almost too calm for the tension that surrounded them. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked. And for the first time, something shifted, not in the room, not yet, but in the space between them, because it was not a challenge, not a threat. It was something else entirely, something that carried weight without needing volume. But Daniel did not hear it that way. He tightened his grip slightly, his jaw setting with the confidence of someone who had never been questioned in moments like this. "Absolutely," he replied, already turning toward the door as if the decision had been finalized long before this conversation even began, and behind him, the room remained silent, unaware that the quiet they chose in that moment was about to become the loudest mistake of all. Daniel did not notice the shift right away because men like him rarely did. They moved through rooms with the certainty that silence meant agreement, that hesitation meant approval, and that authority once asserted would not be questioned. But something in the air had changed, subtle at first, almost invisible, like the moment before a storm breaks when the pressure begins to build, and no one can quite explain why the room suddenly feels smaller, heavier, harder to breathe in. Angela Carter did not resist as he guided her toward the door, her steps steady, unhurried, her posture upright in a way that did not match the situation he believed he was controlling. And as they moved past the long table, a few heads turned, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to follow, just enough to register that something about this did not sit right. A man near the center of the table adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the printed agenda in front of him, his eyes scanning the names again. Slower this time, as if searching for something he might have missed before, while across from him, a woman in a gray suit shifted in her chair, her fingers hovering over a pen that had suddenly stopped moving, the quiet rhythm of note-taking interrupted by a growing sense of unease that she could not yet explain. Daniel reached the door and pulled it open with a firm motion, holding it just wide enough to make his intention clear. "This way," he said, his voice clipped, controlled, already dismissing the situation as resolved, already preparing to move on, as if the moment behind him carried no weight. But Angela did not step through immediately. Instead, she paused, just for a second, her gaze drifting back into the room, not searching for help, not pleading, but observing. And in that single pause, something deeper began to surface. The man with the glasses leaned closer to his colleague and whispered, "Is that name on the list?" His voice low, careful, as if speaking too loudly might confirm a suspicion he was not ready to face. His colleague frowned and turned the page slightly, her eyes scanning until they stopped. And when they stopped, they did not move again, because there it was, printed clearly at the top, Angela Carter, and beneath it, a title that carried weight far beyond the room they were sitting in. She looked up slowly, her eyes now fixed on Daniel's back, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered across her face, not about Angela, but about what had just been allowed to happen. Back near the door, Daniel shifted his stance, impatience creeping into his posture. "We do not have all day," he added, a hint of irritation slipping into his tone, because the longer this took, the less control he felt, and control was something he was not used to losing. Angela finally stepped forward, crossing the threshold with the same quiet composure she had held from the beginning. But as she did, a voice from inside the room broke the silence. Wait, it was not loud, but it was enough to stop. Movement, enough to draw attention. Daniel turned slightly, his expression tightening, as the man with the glasses pushed a chair back and stood, his hand still resting on the printed agenda. "Officer," he said, choosing his words carefully, "do you have clearance for this removal?" The question hung in the air, simple on the surface, but loaded beneath. Daniel frowned, caught off guard not by the question itself, but by the fact that someone had asked it at all. "I am handling a security concern," he replied, his voice firm, falling back on the language he trusted, the language that had carried him through situations like this before. But the man did not sit back down, and neither did the woman beside him. In fact, another chair shifted, and then another, a subtle chain reaction beginning to ripple through the room as more eyes lifted from papers and screens and settled on the scene unfolding near the door. Angela remained still, just outside the room now, her presence no longer at the center of the table, but somehow still at the center of everything. She said nothing, did nothing, and yet the silence she carried with her seemed to grow louder with every passing second, because now it was no longer just about her being removed. It was about who had allowed it, who had watched it, and who was beginning to realize that something had gone very wrong. And Daniel, standing there with the door still in his hand, had not yet realized that the moment he thought was ending was only just beginning. The question did not just hang in the air. It settled into the room like weight, pressing down on every person seated at that table, as Officer Daniel Brooks felt something unfamiliar begin to creep into his chest. Not fear, not yet, but disruption, the kind that comes when a narrative you believed was solid begins to crack under quiet scrutiny. He turned more fully now, his hand still gripping the edge of the door, as his eyes locked onto the man who had spoken, a man in his late 50s with silver hair and a calm but unwavering expression, someone who did not look like he asked questions lightly. "I have full authority to remove unauthorized individuals from secured meetings," Daniel responded, each word measured, each syllable carrying the weight of his training. But beneath that practiced tone there was a subtle tightening, a strain that had not been there before. The man nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if filing the answer away rather than accepting it. And then he glanced once more at the document in front of him, his finger tapping lightly against a name that now seemed to carry more significance than anyone had realized moments ago. Across the table, the woman in the gray suit leaned forward slightly, her voice quieter but no less firm. "Officer, who authorized you to determine that she does not belong here?" Another question, simple, direct, but layered with implication. And now the room was no longer silent in the same way it had been before. It was shifting, awakening, each voice that entered the space pulling more attention toward the center of the unfolding moment. Daniel's jaw tightened as he exhaled slowly, maintaining his stance, maintaining the posture that had always worked for him. "I'm not required to disclose internal security decisions," he replied. But even as he said it, the words felt thinner, less grounded, because the room was no longer passively receiving them. The room was examining them. Angela Carter remained just outside the doorway, her figure framed by the hallway light, her presence quiet yet undeniable. She had not walked away, had not disappeared into the background as Daniel likely expected. Instead, she stood there, still, composed, her hands relaxed at her sides, her gaze steady as it moved between the people inside the room, not seeking validation, not demanding correction, but allowing the truth to unfold at its own pace. And inside, that pace was accelerating. A younger man seated near the far end of the table reached for his tablet, scrolling quickly through a digital copy of the meeting credentials, his brow furrowing as he cross-checked names, titles, departments. And then he froze, his eyes widening just slightly before he looked up, his voice hesitant at first, then clearer. "Sir, her name is listed here," he said, turning the screen so the others could see. There was a brief pause as several heads leaned in, reading, confirming, processing, and then a murmur began, quiet but growing, like a ripple spreading outward across water that had once been still. Daniel shifted his weight, the first real sign that something was slipping, his grip on the door loosening just enough to betray the tension building beneath the surface. "Lists can be outdated," he said quickly, attempting to regain control of the narrative, attempting to place doubt where certainty was beginning to form. But this time, the response did not settle the room. It stirred it. Further, because now people were not just observing, they were thinking, questioning, connecting. The woman in the gray suit straightened in her chair, her voice firmer now, more certain. "This agenda was updated this morning," she said, her eyes meeting Daniel's directly, and there was no hesitation in her tone, no room left for dismissal. The silver-haired man took a step forward from his place at the table, closing some of the distance between himself and the doorway. "Officer," he said again, but this time there was a shift, a subtle change in authority, one that did not rely on volume or force, but on presence and clarity. "I'm going to ask you one more time, on what basis did you remove her?" The question landed differently now, not as a challenge, but as a demand for accountability. And in that moment, Daniel realized something he had not anticipated. The room was no longer behind him. It was no longer neutral. It was turning, slowly but unmistakably, and Angela, still standing just outside, had not needed to raise her voice, had not needed to assert anything, because the truth was already moving toward her, carried by the very people who had chosen silence only moments before. And as Daniel stood there, caught between the doorway and the shifting weight of the room, the certainty he had walked in with began to feel like something else entirely, something fragile, something exposed, something that was no longer enough. The silence that followed the last question was no longer passive. It was deliberate, heavy with expectation, as every eye in the room settled on Officer Daniel Brooks, waiting, not for an explanation, but for a justification that could withstand what was quickly becoming undeniable. And for the first time since he had entered the room, Daniel did not move immediately, his posture still upright, but no longer relaxed. His shoulders held a fraction tighter, his grip on the door loosening just enough that it no longer looked like control, but like hesitation. He cleared his throat softly, a small sound that carried more weight than he intended, as if even that simple act acknowledged the shift that had taken place. "I identified a potential security risk," he said, his voice measured, but now there was something else beneath it, something less certain, less absolute. And the words, once his strongest defense, now seemed to echo in a room that was no longer willing to accept them without question. The silver-haired man took another step forward, closing the distance further, his presence calm but unmistakably firm. "A security risk based on what?" he asked, not raising his voice, not needing to, because the authority in his tone did not come from position alone. It came from clarity. And clarity was something Daniel was beginning to lose. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, as Daniel searched for something concrete, something that would anchor his decision in logic rather than assumption. But the room was no longer giving him time to construct that foundation, because now others were watching closely, analyzing not just what he said, but what he could not say. Across the table, the woman in the gray suit folded her hands slowly, her gaze steady. "Officer," she added, her voice calm but precise. Was there a specific behavior that raised concern, or was this decision made before any interaction took place? The question landed with quiet precision, cutting through the remaining space where Daniel might have hidden behind procedure. And in that moment, the distinction became clear. This was no longer about policy, it was about judgment, and judgment, once exposed, was far harder to defend. Daniel shifted his weight again, the movement subtle but now visible to everyone in the room. His eyes flicked briefly toward Angela, still standing just outside the doorway, her presence unchanged, her composure intact. She had not interrupted, had not spoken over anyone, had not demanded recognition, and yet she remained at the center of every thought in that room, because the questions being asked were no longer about her. They were about him. "I made the call based on protocol," Daniel repeated, but the repetition did not strengthen his position. It weakened it, because now it sounded rehearsed, disconnected from the reality unfolding around him. The younger man with the tablet leaned forward again, his voice more confident this time. "I'm looking at the updated clearance list right now," he said, holding the device slightly higher. "Her credentials are not only valid, they're marked as priority access." There was a ripple through the room at that, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable, a shift in understanding that could not be undone. The silver-haired man exhaled slowly, his expression tightening, just slightly, not in anger, but in recognition of what this moment represented. "Officer," he said once more, and now there was no softness left in the address. "You removed an authorized participant from federal meeting without confirming her status." The words were not shouted. They were stated, and because they were stated, they carried more weight than any raised voice could have. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time, no words came out immediately. The space he had relied on, the space where authority filled in the gaps, was gone, replaced by scrutiny, by accountability, by a room that was no longer willing to accept assumption as fact. Angela finally took a step forward, not back into the room, but closer to the threshold, her presence now aligned with the shift that had taken place inside. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm, steady, and quiet enough that the room leaned in to hear it. "I was invited here," she said, not as a defense, not as a protest, but as a simple truth. And sometimes truth did not need force. It only needed space. And now, for the first time, the room was giving it that space. Daniel felt it then, fully, not just the loss of control, but the weight of being seen, truly seen, not as the authority he believed himself to be, but as the source of the problem unfolding in front of everyone. And the realization did not come with noise or chaos. It came in silence, in a way no one rushed to support him, in the way the room held its ground, waiting, because the moment he had tried to end at the door had now become something much larger, something he could no longer walk away from. Daniel felt the shift settle fully into his chest now. No longer subtle, no longer something he could ignore or push aside with rehearsed authority. It was there, heavy and undeniable, pressing against every word he tried to form, every thought he attempted to organize into something that still made sense in a room that had already begun to move beyond him. And for the first time, he became aware of the silence not as agreement, but as judgment, the kind that did not need to be spoken to be understood. His eyes moved across the faces in the room, searching not for support anymore, but for something he could still hold on to, some sign that the structure he relied on had not completely slipped away, but what he found instead were expressions that had changed, subtly but completely. The neutrality was gone, replaced by focus, by awareness, by a quiet accountability that had begun to take shape the moment the question started. Angela stood at the threshold, neither inside nor fully outside, a presence balanced between two spaces, and yet somehow grounding both, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, her eyes calm, not cold, not distant, just clear, and that clarity was beginning to define the room more than anything Daniel could say. The silver-haired man turned slightly, addressing the others now, his voice even but carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being heard. "We need to take a moment and confirm exactly what has happened here," he said, and the phrasing was important. Not an accusation, not yet, but a recognition that something required attention, that something had crossed a line that could not simply be ignored. The woman in the gray suit nodded once, her pen now resting still on the table. "I agree," she said quietly, her eyes still fixed on Daniel, not aggressively, but firmly, as if holding him in place within the truth that was unfolding. The younger man with the tablet scrolled again, his voice steady now, more certain than before. "Her credentials were verified this morning," he said. "She was cleared at the highest level for this session. There is no indication of any restriction." The words settled into the room with a kind of finality that made it impossible to retreat back into uncertainty, and Daniel felt it. The narrowing of his options, the closing of the space where doubt had once protected him. He inhaled slowly, his chest rising as he tried to reassert control, to find a version of events that would still place him on stable ground. There must be some miscommunication, he said, but even as the sentence left his mouth, it lacked conviction, because miscommunication implied confusion, and this was no longer confusion. This was clarity, hard and unyielding. Angela shifted slightly, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just adjusting her stance as if acknowledging that the moment had reached a point where silence alone would no longer carry everything. Her voice, when it came, was as measured as before. "I checked into the front desk," she said. "They directed me here. I followed the instructions given. Nothing more, nothing less." Her words were simple, free of emotion, free of accusation. And because of that, they carried a weight that no argument could counter. The room absorbed them, not as a defense, but as fact, and facts had a way of dismantling assumptions when given enough space. The silver-haired man looked back at Daniel, his expression now more defined, not harsh, but no longer neutral. "Officer," he said, "this is not a minor procedural matter. This is a removal based on a judgment that appears unsupported by the information available." And now the language had shifted from questions to statements, from uncertainty to assessment. Daniel swallowed, the movement small but visible, his hand finally releasing the door completely as it swung slightly on its hinges behind him. The sound soft but noticeable, like the closing of something he had not intended to let go. He straightened again, tried to reclaim posture if not position. "I acted in good faith," he said, and this time, the words were not about authority. They were about defense, about preserving something of himself in a situation that had already begun to move beyond his control. But the room did not respond immediately because good faith was no longer enough. Not when the consequences of that faith were now visible to everyone present. The woman in the gray suit leaned back slightly, her gaze thoughtful but firm. "Good faith requires awareness," she said, "and awareness requires verification." And in that moment, the statement did not just address Daniel. It defined the line that had been crossed. Angela remained still, her presence unwavering, not demanding resolution, not seeking validation, but embodying something else entirely, dignity, the kind that does not rise in response to conflict, but remains steady through it. And as the room continued to shift around her, as voices aligned and understanding deepened, Daniel stood there, no longer at the center of control, but at the center of consequence. And for the first time, he understood that this moment would not be undone by explanation. It would only move forward, with or without him. The room did not erupt into chaos. It did something far more powerful. It slowed down, and in that slowing, every detail became sharper, every breath more noticeable, every glance more intentional, as if time itself had stretched just enough for everyone to fully understand what was unfolding in front of them. Daniel stood near the doorway, no longer holding it, no longer controlling it, his hands now at his sides, still, but not steady, because stillness without control feels very different from stillness with it. And for the first time, he could feel the eyes on him, not as background noise, but as focus, as evaluation, as something he could not step out of. The silver-haired man turned his attention briefly toward the far end of the table, where another participant had quietly reached for a phone, not to call attention, but to confirm information, to verify what was already becoming clear, his voice low as he spoke into it. Yes, I need immediate confirmation on Angela Carter's assignment to this session. There was a pause as he listened, and that pause stretched across the room like a held breath. No one interrupted. No one filled the silence, because now the silence itself was part of the process, part of the accountability that was taking shape. Angela remained at the threshold, her presence unchanged, her posture relaxed but grounded. She did not shift her weight nervously, did not glance around for support, did not attempt to reclaim the space that had been taken from her, because she did not need to. The room was already beginning to return it, piece by piece, voice by voice. And as she stood there, she was no longer being observed as an outsider, but as someone who had been wronged in a space that was now trying to correct itself. Daniel's mind moved quickly, searching for structure, for procedure, for anything that could reframe what had happened into something manageable, something explainable, but each thought seemed to collapse under the weight of the facts that were being brought forward. He glanced again toward Angela, this time not with dismissal, but with something closer to uncertainty, as if trying to reconcile the version of her he had created in his mind with the reality that was now standing just a few feet away. The younger man with the tablet spoke again, his voice steady. I have cross-referenced her credentials with the federal database. There is no discrepancy. Her access is active and verified. The confirmation did not come as surprise anymore. It came as reinforcement, solidifying what the room had already begun to accept. The silver-haired man lowered the phone slowly, his expression firm as he nodded once. It is confirmed, he said. Her authorization was issued directly from oversight, effective immediately, and with that, the final piece fell into place, not dramatically, not loudly, but definitively, like a door closing on any remaining doubt. Daniel felt it fully now, not just the shift, but the reversal, the complete turning of the room from passive observation to active judgment. And in that turning, he was no longer the one defining the situation. He was the one being defined by it. The woman in the gray suit leaned forward slightly, her voice calm, but unmistakably clear. Then we need to address what just happened, she said, and the phrasing carried weight, not suggestion, not consideration, but necessity, because this was no longer about a misunderstanding. It was about accountability, about the gap between authority and responsibility, and how quickly that gap could expose everything beneath it. Angela finally stepped one pace forward, just enough to re-enter the frame of the doorway, not fully inside, but no longer outside either. Her presence now aligned with the truth that had been established, her voice quiet as she spoke. I am here to observe and report, she said, not defensively, not emotionally, but with clarity, with purpose, and those words carried a different kind of power, not loud, not forceful, but grounded, the kind of power that does not need to prove itself because it already exists. The room absorbed that statement in silence. But it was a different silence now, not avoidance, not discomfort, but recognition. Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the stillness, as he realized something that could no longer be ignored. This was no longer about removing someone from a room. This was about being seen in a moment that could not be undone, a moment that would not fade quietly, a moment that had already begun to define him in the eyes of everyone present. And as he stood there, the weight of that realization settled fully, not as punishment, not yet, but as the beginning of something he could not control, something that would move forward whether he was ready or not, because in that room, in that moment, the truth had already taken its place, and it was not leaving. The room held its breath in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if every person present understood that what came next would define more than just the moment. It would define the meaning behind it. And in that stillness, Angela Carter took one more step forward, this time fully crossing the threshold back into the room, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with the same steady control she had carried from the beginning. Her heels made a soft sound against the polished floor, each step measured, each movement calm, and yet every I followed her now, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition, because the space that had been denied to her only minutes ago was now being returned, not by her demand, but by the room itself. Daniel shifted slightly to the side without being asked. The movement small but significant. A silent acknowledgement that the position he had taken at the doorway no longer belonged to him. Angela passed by him without looking directly at him, not out of avoidance, but out of focus, her attention directed toward the table, toward the purpose that had brought her there in the first place. And as she reached her seat, she paused for a brief moment, her hand resting lightly on the back of the chair, as if grounding herself not in the tension of what had happened, but in the clarity of what was now established. She sat down slowly, her posture straight, composed, her presence no longer questioned. The silver-haired man gave a slight nod, not dramatic, not performative, but respectful, acknowledging not just her return, but the correction that had taken place. "We will proceed," he said, his voice even, but carrying a new layer of awareness, one that had not been there before. And as the words settled, the room began to move again. Papers shifted, pens were picked up, but the rhythm was different now, more intentional, more conscious, as if everyone present had been reminded that authority without awareness could disrupt more than just a meeting. It could disrupt trust itself. Daniel remained standing for a moment longer near the door, uncertain now of where he fit within the space he had once controlled so easily. His eyes moved across the room, catching brief glances that quickly looked away, not out of fear, but out of discomfort, the kind that comes when a mistake has been witnessed collectively, when there is no need for discussion because the truth is already understood. He took a step back, then another, slowly repositioning himself against the wall, no longer at the center, no longer directing anything, just present. And even that presence felt different now, smaller, quieter. Angela opened the folder in front of her, her movements precise, unaffected by the tension that still lingered in the air. She glanced at the documents, then lifted her gaze toward the head of the table, her expression calm, ready, as if the interruption had been nothing more than a brief delay rather than a defining moment. And in that choice, in that quiet return to purpose, there was a kind of strength that did not need to be announced. The woman in the gray suit cleared her throat gently, her voice soft but clear as she resumed the agenda. "We were reviewing the compliance report," she said, and just like that, the meeting continued. But beneath the surface, something had changed permanently. The way people listened, the way they looked at one another, the awareness that had been awakened did not disappear with the return to normal procedure. It stayed, embedded in the room, shaping the way each word was received, each action was interpreted. Daniel lowered his gaze briefly. His thoughts no longer centered on control, but on consequence, on the realization that what had happened could not be undone by silence or by time. It had been seen, acknowledged, and absorbed into the memory of everyone present. Angela, seated calmly among them, represented that shift without needing to say anything more, because sometimes the most powerful response is not reaction, but presence. And as the discussion moved forward, as voices began to fill the room again, it was clear that the moment had passed, but its impact had not. It remained quiet but unshakable, a reminder that in a space built on authority, the true measure of power is not how quickly you act, but how carefully you choose to see. The meeting continued on the surface, voices steady, documents turning, points being made with measured professionalism. But beneath that surface, something else was unfolding, something quieter and far more consequential, because once awareness enters a room, it does not leave when the agenda resumes. It lingers, it sharpens perception, it changes how every word is heard and how every action is interpreted. And now every person seated at that table was not only listening to the discussion, they were also listening to what had just happened, replaying it in their minds, placing it into context, connecting it to patterns they may have noticed before but never fully acknowledged. Angela Carter remained composed, her eyes moving across the documents in front of her, occasionally lifting to follow the speaker, her posture unchanged, her presence grounded, and yet there was a subtle shift in how others engaged with her. When someone referenced a point, their tone carried more care, more precision, as if aware that their words were now part of a larger record, not just a policy, but of integrity. The silver-haired man spoke again, guiding the conversation back to compliance structures and oversight procedures. But even as he spoke, there was a new layer. In his delivery, a deliberate emphasis on accountability, on verification, on the responsibility that comes with authority, and it was not accidental. It was a direct response to what had just unfolded. The woman in the gray suit added to the discussion, her voice thoughtful, highlighting the importance of documented protocols, not as rigid rules, but as safeguards against assumption. And as she spoke, her gaze briefly met Angela's, not an apology, but an acknowledgement, a silent recognition. That something had been learned in real time. Daniel stood near the wall, still quiet, no longer attempting to reinsert himself into the flow of the room, but unable to detach from it either. Every word spoken now seemed to carry a double meaning, one that addressed the topic at hand, and another that reflected back on his actions, and the realization settled deeper with each passing moment. This was no longer about a single mistake. It was about what that mistake revealed about the gap between perception and reality, about the consequences of acting without full understanding. He shifted his stance slightly, his arms now folded loosely, not defensively, but uncertainly, as if searching for a position that made sense in a space that no longer aligned with how he had entered it. A quiet voice from the far end of the table spoke up, referencing a case study involving procedural oversight failures. And as the details were outlined, the parallels became impossible to ignore. A decision made quickly, based on incomplete information, leading to consequences that extended beyond the initial moment. No one said it directly, but everyone felt it, the connection hanging just beneath the surface of the discussion. Angela listened, her expression neutral but attentive, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, clear, and precise, in environments where authority operates without pause for verification. She said, "The margin for error becomes the margin for harm." The room stilled slightly at her words, not because they were confrontational, but because they were exact. They named something without needing to point. They framed the moment without revisiting it. And that was where their power came from. The silver-haired man nodded slowly, acknowledging the point, and several others followed, not out of agreement alone, but out of recognition. Daniel lowered his gaze briefly, the words settling into him in a way that no direct accusation could have achieved, because they did not isolate him. They included him in a broader truth, one that could not be dismissed or deflected. And in that inclusion, there was no escape from understanding. The meeting continued, but it was no longer the same meeting that had begun earlier. It had become something else, something more reflective, more aware, shaped not by what had been planned, but by what had been revealed. Angela returned, her attention to the documents, her presence steady, her role clear, not as someone seeking to reclaim space, but as someone who had never lost it, only had it momentarily challenged. And as the discussion moved forward, as decisions were made and notes were taken, the room carried with it a new standard, unspoken but understood, that authority must be matched by awareness, that presence must be acknowledged before it is judged, and that silence, once broken by truth, does not return to what it was before, because once a room begins to see, it cannot unsee. And Daniel, standing quietly at the edge of it all, was beginning to understand that the lesson unfolding around him was not just being discussed, it was being lived. For a moment, it almost felt as if the room had settled back into normalcy, as if the disruption had been absorbed and filed away like any other minor interruption. The steady rhythm of discussion resumed. Voices measured, documents referenced, decisions outlined with the same calm professionalism that defines spaces like this. And from the outside, it might have looked like everything had returned to order. Daniel Brooks stood against the wall, quiet, contained, his posture once again upright, his expression controlled. And in that stillness there was an illusion, the illusion that he had regained some measure of composure, that the situation had stabilized enough for him to fade back into the background and let the moment pass without further consequence. He adjusted his stance slightly, his hands now resting loosely at his sides, his breathing more even, as if convincing himself that what had happened was now behind him, that it would remain confined to this room, this meeting, this single point in time, the kind of incident that could be explained, minimized, perhaps even forgotten, but the room was not forgetting, even as the conversation moved forward, even as new topics were introduced. The awareness that had been sparked continued to move beneath the surface, shaping the way people listened, the way they interpreted each word, the way they glanced, briefly but meaningfully, toward Angela Carter, who sat calmly among them, her focus steady on the material in front of her, her presence no longer questioned, no longer challenged, but now quietly acknowledged, and that acknowledgement carried weight. Because it had not been given at the beginning, it had been learned. The silver-haired man continued guiding the meeting, his tone consistent, his delivery precise, but there was an added layer of intent in his words, a subtle reinforcement of standards, of processes that required diligence, not assumption. And as he spoke, it became clear that the conversation was no longer just about policy. It was about practice, about how those policies were lived in real moments. Moments like the one that had just unfolded. The woman in the gray suit nodded thoughtfully, adding a point about internal accountability reviews, her voice calm but firm, emphasizing that oversight was not only external, but internal as well, that responsibility did not stop at following procedure. It extended to understanding the impact of each decision. And as she spoke, her gaze once again flickered toward Daniel, not accusing, not hostile, but aware. And that awareness was something he could feel even without meeting her eyes. Daniel shifted again, a small movement, almost imperceptible, but it carried a different energy now. Not control, not confidence, but adjustment, the kind that comes when someone is trying to find footing in a space that no longer feels familiar. He glanced briefly toward the door, the same door he had once stood at with certainty, and now it seemed different. No longer an exit he controlled, but a boundary he had crossed without understanding. A boundary that had consequences he could not simply step away from. A quiet voice from near the end of the table spoke. Up! Referencing documentation procedures for incident reporting, and as the details were outlined, there was a subtle shift in the room's attention, because now the conversation was moving closer to something tangible, something that could extend beyond discussion into action. Angela listened, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, and when she made a brief note in her folder, the sound of pen against paper seemed louder than it should have been, not because of the sound itself, but because of what it represented: record, observation, accountability. Daniel noticed it, even if he did not fully understand why it unsettled him, because that simple act carried a weight he could not ignore. It meant that this moment was not just being experienced, it was being documented, preserved, carried forward. The silver-haired man paused briefly, looking around the table as if assessing the room as a whole. And in that pause, there was a recognition that what had happened was not isolated. It was part of a larger pattern that required attention, not just in theory, but in practice. And as the meeting moved forward, as voices continued and points were made, the illusion of normalcy remained on the surface. But beneath it, something else had taken hold, something quieter, more permanent, the understanding that actions taken without full awareness do not disappear once corrected. They remain, shaping perception, influencing trust, defining credibility. And Daniel, standing at the edge of the room, began to realize that while the meeting might continue as planned, the moment he had created was still unfolding, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, in ways he could not control. And in that realization, the sense of false stability he had begun to cling to slowly started to fade, replaced by something far more real, the awareness that this was not over, it had only just begun. The illusion of normalcy began to fracture the moment the conversation shifted from theory to responsibility, because there's a difference between discussing accountability and facing it, and everyone in the room could feel that difference settling in, quiet but undeniable. The silver-haired man paused once more, his hand resting lightly on the table as he looked across the room, not at the documents, not at the agenda, but at the people, as if measuring something beyond policy, something deeper. And when he spoke again, his tone carried a weight that had not been present at the start of the meeting, We have discussed frameworks, he said, but frameworks only matter when they are upheld in real time. The words were simple, but they landed with precision because they were no longer abstract. They were anchored in what had just occurred. The woman in the gray suit nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. Then perhaps it is time we address this as a real-time case, she said, not raising her voice, not escalating the moment, but grounding it, bringing it into focus in a way that could not be avoided. A few heads lifted, attention sharpening, because now the conversation was no longer moving around the incident. It was moving toward it. Daniel felt it immediately, the subtle tightening in his chest returning, stronger this time because the space for distance was gone. There was no longer a way to separate himself from what had happened. The room was closing that gap. Step by step, the younger man with the tablet glanced up, then down again, as if confirming what he was about to say. For the record, he began, his voice steady but careful. The removal of an authorized participant from a secured meeting without verification constitutes a breach of protocol. The word breach lingered, heavier than anything spoken before, because it carried implication not just of error, but of violation, of something that extended beyond personal judgment into institutional concern. Daniel shifted his weight again, his mind searching for footing, for language, for anything that could soften what was now being defined in terms far beyond his control. I did not intend to breach protocol, he said, his voice controlled, but now clearly defensive. Intention does not negate impact. The woman in the gray suit responded, her tone calm but firm, and that sentence settled into the room with a clarity that no one challenged. Angela Carter remained seated, her hands resting lightly on the folder in front of her, her expression composed, but her presence now carried a different kind of gravity, not because she had asserted it, but because the room had recognized it. She did not interrupt, did not redirect the conversation. She allowed it to unfold, because the truth no longer required her to push it forward. It was moving on its own. The silver-haired man stepped slightly closer to the center of the table, his voice measured. This is not about assigning blame in haste, he said. It is about understanding how and why this happened so that it does not happen again. The phrasing was deliberate, but it did not remove the weight of the moment. It defined it. Daniel lowered his gaze briefly, then lifted it again, meeting the room with a steadiness that felt different now, not confident, not assured, but aware. I made a judgment call based on limited information, he said, and that was the closest he had come to acknowledging the truth. But even that statement revealed the core of the issue, because the room was no longer willing to accept judgment without verification as a sufficient standard. The younger man with the tablet spoke again, his tone more direct now. That is exactly why verification exists, he said, to prevent assumptions from becoming actions. And in that moment, the conversation reached a point of clarity that could not be undone. Angela finally lifted her gaze fully, looking not at Daniel, but at the room as a whole. Her voice calm, steady, and clear. Systems do not fail in silence, she said. They fail when silence replaces accountability. The words did not accuse, they illuminated. And in doing so, they shifted the focus from a single action to a broader responsibility. The room absorbed that, not as a reaction, but as a realization. Daniel felt it settle in, deeper than before, not just as pressure, but as understanding, the kind that does not arrive all at once, but builds piece by piece until it becomes impossible to ignore. And as the room sat in that understanding, as the discussion continued to move forward with a new level of clarity, it became evident that the moment had fully transformed. It was no longer a disruption. It was a case, a lesson, a turning point, and Daniel, standing within it, could no longer see it as something that had simply happened. It was something that now defined what would happen next. The room did not need anyone to announce what had just happened. It had already understood it, absorbed it, and now it was moving towards something deeper than explanation, something closer to consequence, not loud, not immediate, but structured, deliberate, the kind of response that does not come from emotion, but from systems that are designed to correct what has been exposed. The silver-haired man stood fully now, his chair sliding back with a soft but definitive sound, and when he spoke, the tone in his voice had shifted once again, no longer guiding, no longer questioning, but establishing. This matter will be formally documented, he said, each word clear, measured, leaving no room for ambiguity. The room did not react with surprise because by now, everyone understood that this was the natural progression of what had unfolded. The woman in the gray suit nodded once, already reaching for a separate folder, her movements precise, practiced, as if stepping into a process she had carried out before. We will initiate a review of the incident, she added, her voice calm but carrying the authority of procedure. And just like that, the moment transitioned from discussion to action, from awareness to record. Daniel felt the shift immediately, sharper than anything before, because now it was no longer about perception. It was about documentation, about a permanent account of what had taken place. His posture stiffened slightly, not in defiance, but in realization, the kind that settles into the body before it fully forms into thought. I am willing to provide a statement, he said, his voice controlled, but quieter than it had been at the beginning, and that difference did not go unnoticed. The silver-haired man inclined his head slightly. Acknowledgement without endorsement. You will have the opportunity to do so, he replied, but the phrasing was deliberate. It was not an invitation. It was a process, one that would move forward regardless of Daniel's readiness. Angela Carter remained seated, her presence unchanged, her hands resting lightly on the folder before her. And when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm clarity that had defined her from the start. I will include my observation in the report, she said, not as a threat, not as a declaration of power, but as a simple continuation of her role. And that was where the weight of her presence truly settled, not in what she revealed, but in what she represented, because she had never needed to assert authority. The system itself was now aligning around her position, validating it, reinforcing it. The younger man with the tablet began typing, his fingers moving quickly across the screen, capturing details, timestamps, sequence, each element of the moment being translated into record, into something that would exist beyond the room, beyond the immediate. And as the soft tapping of keys filled the silence, it carried a quiet finality, the kind that does not close a moment, but preserves it. Daniel's gaze moved briefly toward Angela, not confrontational, not dismissive, but searching, as if trying to understand how the situation had shifted so completely, how the certainty he had carried into the room had unraveled into something he could no longer define. Angela did not return the gaze directly, not out of avoidance, but because the moment was no longer about personal exchange. It had moved beyond that. It had become institutional, procedural, something larger than either of them. The woman in the gray suit looked up from her notes, her expression composed but firm. We will also review access control procedures to ensure that verification is prioritized in all cases, she said, and again, the words did not single Daniel out. But they did not need to, because the connection was already clear. The room absorbed the statement with quiet understanding. And in that understanding, there was no resistance, no pushback, only acceptance of what needed to follow. The silver-haired man placed both hands lightly on the table, his gaze steady as it moved across the room. Let this serve as a reminder, he said, that authority is not defined by assumption. It is defined by responsibility. And in that sentence, the lesson of the moment was articulated without accusation, without hostility, but with clarity that could not be ignored. Daniel lowered his gaze briefly, the words settling into him in a way that no formal reprimand could have achieved, because they did not isolate him. They placed him within a truth that extended beyond him, a truth that now belonged to the room, to the system, to the process that had been set in motion. And as the meeting prepared to move forward once more, as documents were adjusted and attention shifted back to the agenda, it was clear that nothing had returned to what it was before, because the moment had not just been corrected, it had been recorded. And once something is recorded, it does not fade. It remains, shaping what comes next. And Daniel, standing quietly at the edge of it all, understood that what had begun as a simple decision had now become something far greater, something that would follow him long after the room had emptied, long after the meeting had ended. Because in that room, on that day, the truth had not just been revealed, it had been written. By the time the meeting reached its final segment, the atmosphere in the room had transformed into something far more deliberate than it had been at the start, not tense in the way of conflict, but grounded in a shared awareness that could not be undone. Every voice now carried a measured weight, every statement shaped with a clarity that reflected what had just taken place. The silver-haired man reviewed the final points on the agenda, his tone steady, but there was a subtle gravity beneath it. As if each word was now being placed with intention rather than routine, the woman in the gray suit finalized her notes, closing her folder with a soft, controlled motion, and even that small action seemed to signal something larger, a closing not just of discussion, but of a moment that had already left its mark. Angela Carter remained composed, her attention steady, her presence no longer questioned or tested, but fully integrated into the space. And in that integration, there was a quiet restoration, not something dramatic, not something announced, but something deeply felt, the restoration of dignity that had never truly left her, only been momentarily challenged. Daniel Brooks stood where he had remained for the latter part of the meeting, near the wall, removed from the center, but not from the consequences that had unfolded. His posture was still upright, but it no longer carried the same certainty. It carried awareness, the kind that comes when a person is forced to confront the difference between what they believed they were doing and what they actually did. The silver-haired man looked around the room one final time, his gaze moving from one participant to another, then briefly resting on Angela, not with hesitation, but with recognition, before shifting toward Daniel. And in that shift, there was no hostility, no raised voice, only a quiet, unmistakable acknowledgement of what had occurred. "This session will be concluded," he said, his voice calm, final. "But before we adjourn, let it be clear that accountability is not an abstract concept. It is something that lives in our actions, in our decisions, in the moments we think no one is watching." The words settled into the room with a stillness that felt almost physical, because everyone knew exactly what they referred to. The woman in the gray suit added softly, "And in moments like this, correction is not enough. Understanding must follow, because without understanding, the same mistake will repeat under a different name." Her voice did not accuse, it clarified. It framed the moment in a way that extended beyond the individual and into the system itself. Angela closed her folder gently, her movements calm, deliberate. She stood, not to reclaim space, but simply because the meeting was ending. And, as she did, there was a quiet shift in the room, subtle but real. Several individuals straightened slightly, their attention moving toward her, not out of obligation, but out of respect, the kind that had not been present when she first entered, but had been built through the unfolding of truth. She did not address the room. Again, she did not revisit what had happened, because she did not need to. Her presence alone had already carried the message further than any words could have. Daniel watched her for a brief moment, not with defiance, not with dismissal, but with a recognition that had finally replaced assumption. He understood now, not just that he had been wrong, but how he had been wrong, and that distinction mattered, because it was no longer about a single decision. It was about the mindset behind it, the reflex that had guided it, the gap in awareness that had allowed it to happen. The room began to gather their materials, chairs moving softly, papers being aligned, the natural sounds of a meeting coming to an end. But even in that movement, the weight of the moment remained. It did not dissipate with activity. It stayed, carried in the way people moved, in the way they glanced, in the quiet understanding that something important had been revealed. Angela walked toward the door, her steps steady, her posture unchanged. And as she passed Daniel, there was no confrontation, no exchange of words, only a brief moment where their paths aligned. And in that moment, everything that needed to be understood had already been understood. She continued forward without pause, exiting the room with the same quiet composure she had carried from the beginning. And as the door closed behind her, the sound was soft, almost unnoticeable. But its meaning was not, because she was not the one who had been removed, not in a way that mattered. Daniel remained where he stood for a moment longer, the room around him beginning to empty, the conversation shifting away, the focus moving on, but the impact of what had happened did not leave with them. It stayed with him, settled into the space where certainty had once been. replacing it with something far more lasting: awareness. And as the last of the participants stepped out, leaving the room quieter than it had been all day, Daniel finally understood that authority, when used without understanding, does not elevate a person, it exposes them. And that exposure does not fade when the room empties. It follows, it remains, it becomes part of the story that others will carry forward, long after the moment itself has passed. The room was nearly empty when Daniel Brooks finally moved. The silence now no longer shared but personal, pressing in around him as the last echo of footsteps faded down the hallway. The chairs sat neatly aligned, the long table cleared of the presence that had once filled it with authority. And for the first time since he had walked in, there was no one left to observe him, no one left to question him. And yet the weight of everything that had happened felt heavier than it had when the room was full, because now there was no distraction, no structure to hide behind, only the quiet truth of the moment settling into place. He took a slow breath, his eyes drifting toward the door where Angela Carter had exited, that same door he had once stood in with certainty, believing he was enforcing order, believing he was protecting a space that required control. But now that belief felt different, thinner, stripped of the confidence that had once supported it, because the room had shown him something he could not unsee. That authority without understanding does not protect a system. It disrupts it, and that disruption does not disappear when corrected. It becomes part of the system's memory, part of its record, part of its evolution. Later that afternoon, the report was filed, not with anger, not with exaggeration, but with precision, every detail documented, every moment accounted for, not as punishment, but as truth. And that truth moved forward through the same channels that had once granted access, now serving as a mechanism for accountability. Daniel was called in to provide his statement, the setting smaller, quieter, but no less significant. He spoke carefully, recounting his actions, his reasoning, his assumptions, and for the first time, he heard them as they sounded outside of his own perspective. Incomplete, unverified, shaped more by perception than by fact. And in that realization, something shifted, not dramatically, not suddenly, but steadily, the kind of shift that does not come from being corrected, but from understanding why correction was necessary. Angela's report followed, clear, composed, focused not on personal grievance, but on process, on the importance of verification, on the impact of assumptions when left unchecked. And together, the two accounts formed a complete picture, not of conflict, but of contrast between authority used without awareness and authority grounded in purpose. In the weeks that followed, procedural adjustments were introduced, not as reaction, but as refinement. Access verification protocols were reinforced. Training sessions emphasized awareness alongside authority, and the moment that had once seemed isolated became part of a larger improvement, a correction that extended beyond one room, one meeting, one decision. Daniel remained in his position, but not unchanged. The confidence he carried was no longer automatic. It was considered, shaped by a new understanding of the weight behind each action, each decision. He no longer moved through spaces assuming control. He moved through them observing, verifying, aware, because he had learned, not through instruction, but through exposure, through a moment where the system he represented had reflected something back at him he had not expected to see. Angela Carter continued her work, moving from one review to another, her presence consistent, her approach unchanged, because she had never needed to adjust who she was. The system had adjusted around her, recognizing what had always been there. And in that recognition, her role became clearer, not as someone who demanded authority, but as someone who ensured it was used correctly. And somewhere between those two paths, between Daniel's realization and Angela's consistency, the meaning of the moment settled into something lasting, not as a story of confrontation, but as a lesson in clarity, because in the end, it was never about who was removed from the room. It was about what the room chose to see and what it chose to correct. And as time moved forward, as new meetings filled that same space, as new decisions were made around that same table, one truth remained, quiet but unshakable. He thought he was removing her from the room, but in that moment, the room removed his certainty. and replaced it with something far more powerful: understanding.